I am so excited to be here today with you all. Welcome to Growing Hope, our summit for 2022, I guess. Anyway, we are just delighted to have you here. And for those of you who are getting CME or CEU credits, I just wanted to disclose that we have nothing to disclose. Neither Dr. Ellis nor I have any commercial interests in that would conflict with our presentation, and neither of us are planning to talk about off-label uses of any medications. Our objectives for my part of the talk is to list the 4 building blocks of hope, describe new data supporting healthy outcomes from positive childhood experiences, and describe at least one way to apply the hope framework to your own practice. I want to just say that we want to start by saying that the hope movement the past year has not been mostly from us. We've been orchestrating it, but we've been at the center of thousands of people around the country who are thinking about positive childhood experiences and how to make it part of their individual or organizational practice. And with that, what we'd like to do is ask you to fill out a word cloud. And I'm going to read you the question for the word cloud as we go on, because I want you to look around the virtual room and think about what everyone here is doing. So during the pandemic, there was widespread confusion, conflict, isolation, and loneliness. At the same time, individuals displayed amazing strength and adaptability. So for the word cloud, what strength have you seen that shows a hopeful relationship, environment, engagement, or emotional growth in the families that you've seen, either personally or professionally, as we've gone through the really remarkable disruption of the past 2 years? Patient. Perfect. Compassion, connection, resilience, patience, helpers. And I want to hold on to this because we're going to be talking during my talk, and I'm sure in Dr. Ellis's talk, we'll be talking quite a bit about what makes people resilient and what made it possible for so many families to adapt and respond to the pandemic. So thank you so much. We're going to hold on to this word cloud, and we're going to keep it and post it all around the Hope National Resource Center. Thank you for doing that. So just as a reminder, hope exists for the simple reason that positive experiences promote growth, and children grow into healthier, more resilient adults. And hope seeks to change the way those of us who care for children and families work, so that we center that very important finding about the necessity of positive childhood experiences. And I want to start. Last year, I ended our keynote address in 2021 with the idea that people are like trees, and we collect those experiences. And if you look at the shape of a tree, you can see the positive and negative tree experiences that happened. But it turns out that we live in a forest of positivity. And I want to just call out a few of the people and programs that we've learned from. First of all, the Science of the Positive from the Montana Institute shows the positive exists, and the acronym HOPE and some of the ideas come from conversations with my longtime friend, Jeff Linkenbach. Strengthening Families identified the 5 family protective factors that turned child welfare around to begin to look at strengths. Essentials for Childhood from the CDC took the same positive framework and applied it to policy and culture. Johns Hopkins, particularly Dr. Bethel at the Child and Adolescent Health Measurement Institute, have been reminding us that it's not just surviving that parents want for their kids, it's flourishing. We've begun working with the National Indian Child Welfare Association, have been introduced to the concept of positive Indian parenting, which, while it's not exactly hope, there's a lot of resonance there, and we look forward to working more with them. For a long time, the Search Institute has identified 40 community assets that promote adolescent development. Bright Futures, the guidelines for routine healthcare for children, includes identifying strengths at every visit as part of what pediatricians, pediatric nurse practitioners, and family physicians are supposed to be doing with families when we meet them. And we'll be talking about this later in more detail, but none of this is new. This has been going on for thousands of years, and we're delighted to begin working with faith traditions that bring communities together to support families. So in summary, hope sees people as defined by their strengths as well as their challenges. Hope creates a presumption of strength. Hope creates relationships between providers and families based on mutual respect. And that's particularly important because what we now know is that it's important for our goals and our patients' and families' goals to be negotiated and to be in concordance. And you can't start that if you view families as a pile of deficits, and if families view the providers as judges who are looking under every rock to find the problems. So understanding, identifying, honoring, and promoting individual and family strengths and positive childhood experiences is the basis for achieving a kind of dignity and respect-based practice that leads to concordance in the goals of work. So we're going to talk a little about science to action. We developed the positive childhood experience scale, the 4 building blocks, to start to talk about the role of oxytocin. And then we're going to talk more about action. So I think this might be a good time to ask to put up our whiteboard video. And this is something that we've just produced with the help of We and Goliath, our vendor, to demonstrate very quickly everything we know about the framework of hope. So please go ahead and project that.
Like a tree, we carry our past with us. The Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experiences framework is based on research that shows that positive childhood experiences help create healthy, thriving adults, even when there's been childhood trauma. In the past few decades, there has been a lot of research about the long-term health effects of childhood trauma. But hope provides a path to resilience and adult health through positive childhood experiences. The Hope team has categorized these experiences into the 4 building blocks of hope. These building blocks include relationships within the family and with other children and adults that feel safe and supportive. Safe, stable, equitable environments to live, learn, and play. Social and civic engagement to develop a sense of mattering and belonging. And opportunities for emotional growth. Hope works to shift the focus for anyone who works with children, personally or professionally, from one that is negative or deficit-based, by only identifying risks and problems to one that identifies, celebrates, and promotes access to these critically important positive childhood experiences. Hope promotes a culture of thriving and resilience.
We're so delighted to have a short video that explains the HOPE model. This is our draft, and we hope in the next few weeks we're going to replace the narrator with your voices, so we can make this represent what HOPE really is, which is a collaboration from many, many people. So what I want to do now is say that was what we've known about HOPE, and that explains the basic thing. Now, what I'd like to do is talk about the new knowledge that we are gathering now about HOPE, and to highlight in particular a study that was recently published from Australia. So if we can go back to the PowerPoint and see, as we go along, we developed the PCE scale with the help of the people at Hopkins. And my slide changer doesn't seem to be working. So let's go on to, there you go. So we developed the positive childhood experience scale based on the Wisconsin Behavioral Risk Factor Survey that already included questions about ACEs. We asked about positive childhood experiences and correlated those with mental health. Next slide. As a quick reminder, we asked families, asked adults, how often as a child had they felt able to talk to their family about feelings? felt their families stood by you during difficult times? How often did you enjoy participating in community traditions? Feel a sense of belonging in high school? Feel supported by friends? Have at least two adults other than your parents who cared about you, took a genuine interest in you? And how often did you feel safe and protected by an adult in your home? So as I mentioned, this was done in Wisconsin in the 2015 survey, and we're delighted to let everyone know that it's now been completed in 4 additional states and is in progress in a 5th. And during this year, we're working with our colleagues at the CDC to further analyze these data, first of all, to verify the building blocks of hope, and secondly, because we're very interested in using a larger population to do some more advanced analyses of who in particular might benefit from positive experiences and what else we can find out about urban and rural populations in the United States. So on the next slide, I want to start by saying that there are also these 4 building blocks of hope. And these were developed with Charlotte and Harper Brown, and we did it by looking at the existing literature. What did children and youth who experienced in programs that work, what happened to them? And we identified 4 building blocks: relationships, an environment, a safe, stable, and equitable environment to live, learn, and grow, opportunities for engagement, for civic engagement, for social engagement, ways to develop a sense of mattering. And finally, children needed opportunities for emotional growth. And much of this happens through peer play and through child-centered play. So we developed this looking at the literature, looking backwards and seeing what happened in intervention programs. But as you can see on the next slide, there's a recent study, it's actually still in press, from Guo et al. In Australia, and they validated these same 4 building blocks. Their paper called Measuring Positive Childhood Experiences, testing its structural and predictive validity of the HOPE framework. And the study used the HOPE framework as a foundation to develop population-based measures of PCEs. And what they found is the 4-factor model is an empirically valid structure. On the next slide, just a little more detail. What they did is they followed over 5,000 children from birth. This was the 2004 birth cohort. They measured positive childhood experiences 5 times during childhood. And then for an outcome, they looked at 2 outcomes of health and well-being in young teenagers, ages 14 and 15. They looked at their mental health and their academic skills. And on the next slide, you can see how they identified these building blocks. The building block of relationship corresponded to items on their survey about positive parenting and trusting, supportive relationships. The building block of environment looked at neighborhood livability and facilities, neighborhood social capital, and the home education environment. And the building block about engagement looked at the child's contact with family and friends, activities outside the home, enjoyment of childcare, school, neighborhood, all of those things. And what they found on the next slide, as an example of their finding, was that positive childhood experiences protect against poor mental health at age 14 and 15. So all of these arrows go down because they protect against a bad outcome of poor mental health. And what you can see is that whether individuals experience positive experiences at 0 to 1 years, 4 to 5 years, or throughout childhood, 6 to 7 years, at any age, they had, 6 to 7 years, 8 to 9 years, 10 to 11 years, at any age during childhood, PCEs protected against poor mental health. And this is really delightful. This is the opposite way of what we did our study. This is prospectively looking at children from the time they were born onwards. So we have even more confidence now about the 4 building blocks of hope. The next slide, the other piece of science that I won't go into today, is we talked about how the brain develops, in particular oxytocin, which the internet calls the love hormone, but is the hormone that's released when we give birth and when we fall in love, and causes substantial brain changes. And there's been an unbelievable outgrowth of experiments and understanding of the role of oxytocin. And these are 3 highly cited papers that appeared just in the last year or two. Physical touch during father-infant interactions is associated with the father's oxytocin levels. Oxytocin-related biomarkers can be seen in anxiety and mood disorders. In other words, if they're lower in those disorders. And people are starting to look at the epigenetics, the role of mother-child interactions and DNA methylation of the oxytocin receptor. There's going to be a lot more basic science coming out now about positive childhood experiences. And I compare this to what happened at the beginning with ACEs and toxic stress, where once they identified the phenomenon that trauma harmed child development, they began to look at the brain science. And now, many years later, doing the same with positive experiences. We're also growing hope. We're moving from science to action. We're getting the word out, and we're going to talk about countering misperceptions and developing resources. We're also doing training and technical assistance. Many of you may have participated in HOPE webinars. We're now training dozens of facilitators around the country, and we're working closely with partner organizations to support them as they undergo the HOPE transition. So on the next slide, we talk about challenging misperceptions. And a lot of this is because we've been having webinars and Zoom meetings and trainings and talks with literally thousands of people. We reached over 10,000 people in 2021. And not only did we talk, but we also listened. So I want to focus on two misperceptions that we've identified. The first one is that we know that Growing Hope builds on trauma-informed care. However, there's a common misperception that we're asking people to choose between whether they should be doing trauma-informed care or hope-informed care, but we're complex, each of us. And as we show on the next slide, the HOPE model directly builds on everything we learned from the trauma-informed care revolution that happened over the last few decades. What we learned was that children's brains respond to experience, not just in the moment, but they carry those experiences in structural and functional changes. That birth to 3 and adolescence are sensitive stages. Those are periods of not only rapid brain growth, but changes in brain structure. We've also learned that some childhood experiences are therapeutic, and many of the people we spoke with are actually delivering evidence-based care. So even children with high ACEs can recover. And we found that most adults already understand why childhood experiences matter. So when we talk about the importance of positive childhood experiences, it's a little bit like pouring water into a sponge. People are really ready. And the bottom line we've learned from really remarkable individual stories from some of the providers about themselves and the families they care for is that people can heal and flourish even after past trauma. So the next slide, the second misperception is this pandemic has been awful. And it's been enormously disruptive, but there's a common misperception that families have fallen apart, and families have not fallen apart. So we at the Hope National Resource Center have been studying this, looking at it every which way, and trying to get the message out that love within a family, family structures have adapted and protected children and helped in so many ways. It's not to say that they're not, for example, right now, big mental health problems to deal with, but the misconception that families, particularly families from groups other than the speakers, usually, were having major problems, are just wrong. So we've done surveys with the American Academy of Pediatrics and Prevent Child Abuse America, and we've shown that even when feeling very, very stressed by remote learning, 60% of families report that they have grown closer to their children, specifically through education, even though many, many, many are feeling stressed. We reported in Pediatrics, we wrote a perspectives article that talked about the stories and experiences that we had in reaching thousands of providers around the country, and just talking about how there is reason for hope, even during the depths of the pandemic. And most recently, we published in JAMA Pediatrics, another major pediatric publication, that child physical abuse did not increase during the pandemic. And many experts thought it would, and many experts have been saying that it did, but the data show that it didn't. Reports are down, hospitalizations are down, emergency department visits are down. Without going into all the details, it seems as if we as a society did enough to protect families, perhaps through stimulus checks and WIC and eviction protection and unemployment insurance and family local supports, that parents were able to do what they do best, which is love their children, support them, and protect them. And I think there are lessons to learn from the missed epidemic of child abuse that did not happen during the pandemic. And we're working with our colleagues to really drive home that when families have the support, so they're not super stressed, they don't abuse their children, or they're less likely to abuse their children. And these are messages of hope, because so much of what we talk about is focused on all the disasters that occur that we miss the message that most families have done a remarkable job adapting to this incredibly disruptive time. So on the next slide, I want to just finish by saying hope is growing. Next slide. So hope works by collaborating with families, communities, researchers, and policymakers. This has been a wonderful, wonderful experience for many of us as we talk with children and families and organizations and providers and researchers and advocates and policymakers, and really finding how many people are so deeply invested in the success of children and families and the communities in which they grow up. And in fact, on the next slide, you are growing hope, that there are Hope Weeks in Kansas and Idaho. Today is day 2 of the Week of Hope in Kansas, and our hats off to Governor Laura Kelly and Vicki Roper, who connected with her to talk about hope. West Virginia home visitors are now all receiving hope training. In Massachusetts, we're working with 2 different state agencies, spreading hope to state employees and vendors. California and Maine have been using hope in their respective resilience building networks. And this is only scratching the surface of what's happening. On the next slide, we are working really hard to grow our own networks. We have a national advisory board with leading voices in the field who give us candid advice, often difficult advice, but super helpful. We've just convened what we call the Face of Hope, family and community experts, people who are now raising children, who talk to us about the messages that we're giving and how they strike. Are we hitting the right tone? Are we clanging? What's missing? We have Hope Innovation Networks. We've launched the second one. These are learning collaboratives that implement hope together. And we had originally planned to have 5 organizations. We got 25 applications. We ended up funding 11 and are reaching out to the others to provide support. So many people want to be part of hope and use it to innovate in organizational work. And we found ourselves partnering with organizations around the world to help them fulfill their own missions. In the next slide, last year, we talked about how positive and adverse childhood experiences affect humans, that we're like trees. If you look at a tree, you can see its history. And now I want to go to a poll and thinking about that tree metaphor. Where are you right now? Is your involvement in hope sprouting? Are you a seedling, a young tree, flowering, or is it bearing fruit? So go ahead, and if you could launch the poll, and we'll see where today's group is so we can plan for the future. Oh, there you go. So we're starting to see the answers, and it looks like we're really doing well. I'm surprised. This is delightful. Quite a few people have sprouted or seedlings, but look, we already have young trees flowering, and even some people at today's meeting where hope is bearing fruit for them in their organizations. So that's terrific. We're going to repeat this next year and see how we're doing. But this is absolutely delightful. And thank you so much for taking this framework and using it to make your own work more effective and resonate better with the spirit that you went into the work with. Next slide. Next slide. So what we have planned for next, we're gathering more knowledge of the effects of childhood experience. We're learning through our networks what positive childhood experiences means to people of different cultures and experiences. And we, as a group, are appreciating the wisdom and dedication of the individual providers and organizational leaders that we've met and worked with. Next slide. So as we look forward, next year, you can expect to see some more HOPE science developments, reports from HOPE implementers, a new HOPE clergy community that's launching soon, and really more discussion of HOPE in policy. Next slide. So we invite you to grow HOPE with us. HOPE is flexible. The 4 building blocks don't change, but how you interpret them and fill them with specific positive childhood experiences will reflect your own culture and setting. So learn about HOPE. We have a website, we have lessons, we have webinars, trainings. Read our blogs, write one, adapt HOPE to your setting, invite you to make a 30-day plan for yourselves at the end of today and advocate for HOPE in policy and practice. So with that, we couldn't be more delighted to be with you here today. And I've given you a brief overview of where HOPE's been, where it's going, how excited we are, and that we are, in fact, becoming a movement. It is such a pleasure now for me to introduce my friend and colleague, Wendy Ellis, to you. So I first met Dr. Ellis years ago in Washington, when she came and spoke at the Center for Study of Social Policy. It was eye-opening. Of course, like many of you, I've read her papers, and I understand the pair of ACEs and the importance of adverse community experiences. But Dr. Ellis is not an academic who's willing to sit back and measure things and do correlations and write papers. She spent the last decade developing and working to grow a resilience movement to address systemic inequities that contribute to social and health disparities that are often transmitted in families and communities from generation to generation. And her Building Resilience Collaborative and the Resilience Catalyst networks are right now implementing building community resilience and the community resilience framework, strategies for cross-sector partners to align resources, programs, initiatives, and community-based efforts to address adverse childhood experiences and community adversity. And I think that, sometimes if you go down the rabbit hole of looking at positive childhood experience, you end up putting everything on the shoulders of parents. Parents are wonderful. They love their children. They are, in fact, the most powerful positive factor in children's lives. But parents live in communities, and communities can make it harder or easier for them to accomplish their goals, their hopes, and their dreams, and do a great job raising children. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Wendy Ellis from George Washington to talk with us about building resilient communities.
Oh, thank you so much, Bob. This is like such an honor and so exciting to be able to work with you and to address this group as we think about how do we build really hopeful and resilient communities. How do we grow hope? This is not something that is ephemeral, that is aspirational. This is something that we can actually do together. And there's science that backs this up. Science that comes from multiple disciplines, not just behavioral and health sciences, but also political science, understanding the science of social determinants. Believe it or not, the science of emergency preparedness and disaster relief, all of that rolled up into really thinking about what does it take to build resilience, to foster hope, and actually put community and our children at the center of this work. So I'm going to try and see if this technology works for me, and let's dive in. So before we go any further, I want to first do a level set. When we talk about resilience, what do we mean? It's really important to not use, just the framing that comes from physics, which is, resilience is an object's ability to bounce back after suffering impact. Particularly after COVID, this kind of framing really limits us in our ability to put all of the supports and all of our resources in communities as they need it. So when we talk about resilience at the Center for Community Resilience, yes, we recognize that there will be chronic and at times acute adversity of which we need to bounce back from. But ideally, what we want to do is actually help our communities and our lawmakers and our systems recognize that every community, every family, every child has that ability to bounce forward and thrive. That's what we mean by community resilience, is that what are we putting in place so that our communities can bounce forward and thrive, not just settle for where they've already started, which oftentimes are in equitable places. So at the Center for Community Resilience, what we do is 4 really aligned and coordinated lines of work. We have the Building Community Resilience Networks, which are implementing the Building Community Resilience process that brings together cross-sector partners from health, from social services, from public transportation, from public education, law enforcement, and criminal justice, all of them sitting at the table and really beginning to understand what are the problems that we are trying to solve, and what are the assets that we can bring to bear to address these things. From this work, we've understood that equity is important, meaning that we meet our communities where they are and we give them the supports and the resources that they need to bounce forward. Through this work and my research on community resilience, creating a community resilience framework, we have recognized that there is an opportunity that is built for this time to put local public health departments at the center of the resilience movement. Because at the heart of public health is social justice. And so what more time than now to have public health actually being the convener to help our systems work together to address the most entrenched aspects that are driving adversity reliably and predictably in our communities. And so that's our resilience catalyst in public health. That's the initiative that we're working with local public health departments. But of course, when we're talking about systems change, that means that we're talking about policy, not just big P policy. That's important, legislation, but also small p and appropriations, making sure that the money that we are already putting on the street is going to where communities need it most in an equitable fashion. So you hear me constantly talking about equity. And where did that come from when we started with ACEs? Well, it came from this network, from our community partners, from those parents that were at the table leaning into the conversations and to help us understand what was driving adversity in their communities and why it was so important to be able to lean in and understand, whether that's in Washington State or in Appalachian District, North Carolina. You see, there's a mix of red and blue states here, and some that would be recognized as more conservative or more liberal than others. But regardless of your political stripe, adversity suffered by our children and our families are the same. And so this is where we find this common ground to really think about what is fertile in our ground, all of our ground, to grow hope, to foster resilience, to help our children bounce forward and thrive, meeting our communities where they are and drawing the line on equity where it makes a difference in that community. And so, as I said, quoting one of my favorite songstresses, Tina Turner, what's equity got to do with it? Well, after doing this work for almost 20 years now, every time that we hear these stories about trauma, community trauma, personal trauma, at the root are some levels of inequity, whether that's inequitable access to behavioral health care, inequitable access to educational supports, substance abuse, even public transportation. And why do you say public transportation? Well, how are we expecting parents to be able to get from point A to point B in an efficient manner so that they can support their parents, their families? Public transportation is just as important as many of the other cross-sector partners that we talk about. And so helping us, meaning us, the academics or the practitioners who come to this work with very good intentions, but oftentimes come with a little bit too much book knowledge and not enough sensitivity of the lived experience. And so putting that aside and really leaning into the conversation, we began to understand that if we were not putting equity in the center, there's no hope of ever getting to community resilience. That it's not fair to ask parents to be resilient if we're not willing to lean into the conversation, the tough conversations that help us to understand what drives adversity in this country. And that comes to structural racism. Full stop. What our communities oftentimes are dealing with are the remnants of explicit policies and practices that have driven adversity intentionally, reliably, and predictably. And if we still need convincing of that, I want you to pay attention to what was just passed in Congress last night. After more than 100 years of having much solicitation and advocacy around making lynching a federal hate crime, it was finally passed last night. Finally will go to a president's desk to be signed. Think about that. One of the most inhumane acts of hatred. It took more than 100 years and more than 200 attempts to have our government recognize what has been a source of trauma and what has been a source of fear in many of our communities. So there's no denying that there is inequity that is deeply rooted in our structures, deeply rooted in our soil, that we must be willing to lean into and discuss. My phone has gone off this little clicker thing that we have, so I'm going to ask you to advance my slides. I want to really pay attention to what I'm discussing right now, because what you are familiar with, one of our first tools, was the pair of aces tree that really helped with communities to discuss what's in our roots and how is that relevant to your community. And using the pair of aces framing, it allowed for us to lean into these conversations with parents, not in a blaming fashion, but in a way that we can begin to share our truths, in a way that we can begin to understand our experiences, in a way that we can begin to understand how systems contribute and oftentimes exacerbate what's happening under the roofs of our homes, that's happening on the sidewalks of our community. The difference between the outcomes and the systemic drivers, being able to identify and realize that as a country, as practitioners, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, meaning that we can focus on both, because just focusing on those branches and those leaves, that doesn't really get to the root cause. So sharing this tree with the field was a way to begin to move towards that pathway that will foster hope, understanding that equity has to be there as the center of this. And so, thus, from all of this information came this framework, leaning into the science, behavioral science, science of social determinants, but also, again, the science of what we've already learned when we've talked about responding to disasters, when we've been able to identify those components that were so important for those communities that bounce back, and for some communities that never bounce back from, say, a tornado, say, a school shooting, some of those that lacked even the essential ingredients for hope. And those came from really looking at what is that outer ring there, social cohesion and social capital. So when Bob first approached me about joining this year for this talk and outlined to me the 4 essential blocks of building hope, it really aligns so well with this community resilience framework. Understanding that relationships, environment, engagement, and emotional growth are essential to fostering hope. But these components of our community actually help to nurture those things. Housing and housing stability, education and educational quality, criminal justice and law enforcement, they all influence this tenor, mood, as well as the supports and buffers that are in place to help our families bounce back after trauma, but also absolutely necessary to help our children bounce forward and thrive. We know from the social determinant literature that housing stability and affordability is essential, not just for a parent's well-being, but also for a child's development. We know that housing as a stock in itself, whether it's the safety and the value, also influence how we finance our schools. There's a one-to-one relationship between the value of a house in a community and how much money is put into the schools. But that also follows this formula of differential policing practice in our neighborhoods. And so when we built this community resilience framework, we were looking very much so at the social determinant literature, looking at those sectors that are most proximal to the community environment and influencing the community environment. And so this wasn't a way to say, oh, these are what all of these sectors are doing wrong. It's like, here's the opportunity to actually build those communities, those environments that will grow hope, that will foster hope. And most importantly, reinforcing the message of why it is so important to make sure that we're doing that in an equitable manner and that these sectors are so key to that. So let's zoom in and understand specifically what are those community factors that we're talking about when we talk about housing, and understanding specifically what are the factors, and also reframing what we think about as social determinants to really think about them as performance indicators. Imagine that this isn't just about what we ascribe as a characteristic to an individual, but these are characteristics of a community. And they also let us know how systems are operating differentially from community to community. So when we look at home ownership rates, when we look at stability in housing, yes, an individual family can be homeless or housing unstable, but that's not just a characteristic of that family. No, that's actually a performance indicator of our housing industry, our housing stock. There is something that is fundamentally wrong if we can reliably and predictably look at certain zip codes and say we have a higher rate of homelessness or individuals who are housing stable, and then just think that vouchers are the answer. No, that statistic represents the experience of individuals, but it also represents the performance of that sector. So having that sector at the table to really understand their contribution to the problem that we're trying to solve is the pathway to fostering hope, is the pathway to equity. And similarly, understanding and bringing to the table our public education system to not just look at graduation rates as something that's happening or not happening for individuals, but actually that's a report card on our school systems. And helping our school systems look at that as an indicator of hope. If we have rising graduation rates, if we have rising parental engagement in schools, that means that parents actually think that there's a pathway for their children, that we have fostered hope in that community because there's a hope for tomorrow. That if my child can perform and be treated equitably, and also teachers can be supported in a way that they themselves want to see these children rise above, know that these children can, then that's the indicator. That's the way that we want to approach this work. Now, one of the things that is also important is recognizing that when we are talking about law enforcement and criminal justice, not just separately, but together, what are the opportunities to foster hope when it comes to public safety? Well, I can remember growing up in a neighborhood that was predominantly Black, where we weren't afraid of police officers, unless, of course, we were doing something that perhaps would get us in trouble. Not to say that all police officers were reputable, but not all of them were bad. But how were we working together towards the same aim? How were we seeing community safety as a collective good and defining it together? How do we come to the table to see each other? Well, that means that we have to be at the table together and actually understanding each other's performance and engagement as something that is moving us towards a collective goal. That's really tough work, particularly in today's environment, but it's not impossible. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Meaning that we really have to have all of these sectors together to understand collectively their role, their contribution to the outcomes that we see. This isn't some namsy-pamsy kind of talk like, ooh, we can all just come together and suddenly hope will arise. But I can tell you it won't arise if we don't try. And try we must and continue to keep at this work. You see, one of the reasons why we have fear as a bubble, a contextual in this model of community resilience, is because what we see today is fear over hope. We have not conquered the fear, and we will not get to hope if we don't do that. And how do we do that? We have to be at the table together. We have to hear each other. We have to see each other. We have to start where we can. And that's the work that we're seeing with our partners across the country. And that's why I'm so happy to be able to share with you our newest tool. It's not enough to talk about the problems that we're trying to solve. We also have to paint a vision. If we're successful, where will we be? And what will those successes look like? So when we talk about community resilience, what does that look like? It looks like safe and stable neighborhoods, which means that we do have to have all of those sectors at the table, recognizing their contribution to safety and stability. And this is why we call out law enforcement and why we call out housing that have to be at the table, because they are most proximal to contributing to those two factors. Community agent advocacy and agency. Can you go back one more slide? Because two more slides. I really want to show the model in full to really begin to hone in on these two factors. One more, please. You see the social capital and social cohesion there in that model? That's the glue. Social cohesion, what is in the building blocks of hope when we talk about engagement and relationships. Those things are absolutely necessary, and the environment has to nurture those things so that community has agency. And what do we do with that agency? That becomes social capital, so that a community not only is advocating, but actually has a collective power with their community representatives for change. Not that we're swooping down as agents and saviors to save a community, but we've actually created an environment of social cohesion so that communities themselves have the ability to express their power and exercise as such in social capital. And this comes from the literature with regard to disaster preparedness and emergency response. That those communities that were able to bounce back were able to do so because they were taking care of each other, and they were able to successfully advocate for the responses in the manner that they needed. Not that FEMA came in and decided you need trailers here and you need this because that's what's on their checklist. No, it's because community came together and actually advocated for the things that they need, and they were heard. And so if you can fast forward back to the resilience tree, that's why these things are so important. Because it's not just us as academics, or I actually prefer the term pracademic, but it is because we have gotten out of the way and provided the necessary supports so that community voice can be heard. And that's so important to all of this, because when you look at the roots in the soil, in this resilience tree, how will we know what is a health promoting infrastructure, or affordable even, if we have not included community in that decision-making process? When we talk about community-driven policy, that means that we're making decisions together with community, not for community and not on behalf. That's what community resilience looks like. It means that because of that agency and that ability to build off of the resources that are already in place in many communities, but not necessarily in a way that is equitable, that we are providing social and economic mobility. And most importantly, at the end of the day, we have more healthy and supported individuals and family. So when we talk about what community resilience looks like, that's why it was so important to have this tool. Because we had used the Parabasis tree, many of you have used this to effectively bring coalitions together to identify the problem that we're trying to solve. But now, more than 10 years into this, we should be at the point where we have measurement. So if you can go to the next slide, I want to talk about not only how we measure, but how we get there and what we can build upon. So many of our partners are building community resilience by working across multiple sectors to create integrated programs, like our Parent Connects partners in Cincinnati, Ohio, Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and Beach Acres, who have integrated social services and primary care to have parent coaches inside the primary care practice that actually support parents, identifying needs for supports, whether those are social supports or emotional supports, in real time, as part of the practice team, and reimbursed for their efforts. That's what community resilience looks like. Trauma-informed workplaces that our partners in Watauga County, North Carolina are working on, recognizing that many returning citizens needed help with not only finding jobs, but keeping jobs. So making sure that they have both access to affordable housing, but also access to social supports that are necessary as they reintegrate, but also just families in general being able to find not only affordable housing, but those social supports that they need via their employer. In Washington, D.C., recognizing that affordable access to early childhood education meant more than just a voucher for daycare. It meant actually raising the bar that we expect more for our children. And so using city dollars, actually creating a certification process for early childhood educators and providing a pathway to education for these individuals so that they can, please go back, so that they can move forward and also provide quality care for our children. That's just an example of some of the work that we're doing. So if we can move forward to the policies that have helped to support this work, using a 2-gen framework that fosters social capital, that stimulates family economic mobility, are the pathways forward. So when we're thinking about, when we talk about how we design these programs, we have to have those lawmakers and those in a position of holding the appropriation dollars to really think about how do we build these environments that actually provide 2-gen supports. Home visiting programs we know are extremely important. And the fact that we were able to expand those during COVID to virtual visits was extremely important when you think about the urban-rural divide, but also just the inability for many families to be able to be accessible to some of the just social supports because of our public transportation or infrastructure issues or other transportation issues. Again, meeting families where they are so important when we talk about not just home visiting, but the social supports that are needed. And then workforce development. Really providing trauma-informed care. We already have budgetary levers to be able to access these things, whether that's through the Families First Act or through ARPA. And those are at the county level. And so making sure that not only we as advocates, but also community members are able to advocate for these things, that's really has been an important strategy. So I want to go to two more slides, actually, to get us to really thinking about how to put these things into work, but also the framing that's so necessary. Now, when we talk about growing hope, oftentimes we focus on just the child-parent dyad. But in order to foster an environment that helps to grow hope, that has equity at the center, we have to go way upstream. And many of you may think, oh my goodness, I'm a practitioner. I am not a policy person. This is not what I do. If not you, then who? You have the best evidence. You are closest to the voice to inform policy that actually works for our families. And most importantly, we are the ones that will be measuring how effective our policies are and actually addressing the needs of our community. So of course, you have a role. We have a role in informing big P policy as well as small P policy with our parents and our community members by our side. And so connecting that very upstream policy and understanding then how that policy is implemented and even how it's received will be influenced by the context in which we are in our communities, whether that's neighborhood desirability, the effects of racism as that varies from community to community, the political interest. We have to be cognizant of these things, and we have to be willing to talk about these things with our families because our families are experiencing them. And then changing our paradigm, shifting it so that we are actually shifting responsibility upstream and not just on the shoulders of our communities and on the shoulders of our families. Meaning affordability isn't about the lack of savings, and to a certain extent it is, but what I mean is that it's not solely about an individual's ability to have a savings account so that they can afford. It's also about whether or not we are really pricing communities in a way where our families can afford it. What is our system's responsibility to actually meeting community where they are? When we think about food insecurity, it's not enough to just have a voucher for healthy, nutritious foods or to have a farmer's market. We have to ask ourselves fundamentally, why are our food systems so inequitably balanced? That's the performance of a system, whether that's economic development or city planning. But again, we cannot keep putting this on the shoulders of community or even philanthropy for that point. This is a systems issue. Educational attainment, as I said before, yes, a person and the level that they reach for educational attainment is certainly a personal characteristic, but a graduation rate is a systems indicator. Let's hold our systems accountable while we are fostering hope in families. The two are inextricably linked. And so if we just stop at those social determinants and go downstream from there, we're not actually growing hope. All we're doing is patching people up and sending them right back out into the same environments that create the cycle of health and social outcomes that we've been seeing over and over again. So I hope that you can use this new tool. We'll go to the last slide to really begin to lean into the vision, not just discuss the problem that we're trying to solve, but let's create the vision. Because when we can see where we're going, when we can articulate What are our goals for our children and our families? And we can hold our systems accountable by putting measures in place that not only have meaning to the systems, but we know have a direct impact on the outcomes that our children and our families face and can achieve if given the buffers and supports necessary in an equitable fashion. That's what community resilience looks like. Now, as I said earlier, it took 100 years to pass a piece of legislation that more than everyone could acknowledge should have been passed years ago. So I will disabuse myself of being optimistic that these changes will happen in my lifetime. But that doesn't mean that we don't start working now. It doesn't mean that we give up hope. Actually, the fact that this finally got passed gives me hope, gives me determination. And it should also similarly give you hope that we can build resilient communities, that we can foster hope. And in that soil are the equitable access to all of the supports, all of the buffers. That's what's in our soil. That's what community resilience looks like. And together we are going to build hope. So thank you so much for this morning being here, and let's get to work.
Wendy, I want to thank you so much for a really, really inspiring talk. And while people are writing in questions, I just want to ask you a quick question, maybe a long answer. But if we look at urban areas for the past generation, there's been a complete failure to notice the effects of community capital in poor neighborhoods. So in the 60s, there was urban renewal, and Tufts Medical Center is located in Chinatown, which is a source of really great cultural strength for the Asian community, particularly new immigrants. But the city tends to look at it as places with crowded housing or places that you might want to develop to a higher use. So how do you illustrate the good things, the connections that already exist in the communities without undermining efforts to improve equity?
Yeah, so there's so much in that question. I think one of the issues is, first off, systems recognizing the harm that was done with urban renewal. Regardless of whether that was Chinatown in Boston or Treme in New Orleans or the West End Kenyon Bar in Cincinnati, Ohio, everywhere that urban renewal occurred, there was major trauma, major disruption that occurred in those neighborhoods, typically neighborhoods that were identified as being blighted, dilapidated, tenement types homes. And there was no regard for the communities that were there. In fact, in Cincinnati, Ohio, where the urban renewal project, it was one of the largest urban renewal projects in the country that displaced 25,000 families. 25,000, let that sink in. And there was no recognition of that trauma. There was no recognition or even as much as an apology, because the city had promised that all of the individuals who were being moved were going to be moved into upgraded housing. And that was not just Cincinnati. Many times when the history of these urban renewal projects is such that there was always a promise that there's going to be something better. That yes, this is going to be traumatic to move you from here, but oftentimes that trauma was met with NIMBYism. So individuals that were being moved from those areas were promised that they would be moved elsewhere. But of course, there was strong opposition to having, individuals who were of lower income, communities of color being moved into areas that did not look like either of those. And so you had the trauma of rejection. So when you look at the so-called resilience of these communities, it is because they had nothing else to build upon but each other. And now that you have these speculators that are coming in, whether that's Chinatown in Boston, or if it is, east of the river here in Washington, D.C., and coming in and wanting to build up, but again, not wanting to actually build up for the benefit of those who are there. There's a lack of understanding of the humanity, of recognizing the humanity for these individuals. And that is, that goes back to my remark about the lynching bill. It's like, how can we foster hope when we know communities, we're not recognizing that? And I say we, even though I personally work towards this, but I'm also part of a system. I'm part of an academic system that still does not necessarily recognize the humanity of individuals and communities of not just color, but those of also of lower income. So we have to change the culture in this country. And the only way to do that is by having these explicit and very painful conversations so that we can get to a level of humanity. Until then, Bob, I don't think that we can just simply have these moral conversations about how do you get developers to see the value. The developers are trained to see value in land, not in people. And that's where we have to have a major paradigm shift. So when we're talking about growing hope, we have to be able to see each other. And that's where I think it's so necessary to have what I feel are the foundation for change are these conversations.
Wendy, thank you so much. That was really eloquent. I think that building on what you said, developers work within their systems to maximize their own incentives. So that means that there needs to be systems change. You can't rely on developers. You can't rely on lions not to eat gazelles.
Yeah. I mean, when you're in a system, you're trained to what you are incentivized to achieve. And so, a developer is incentivized to achieve maximum profit. And that's without much regard for humanity. So, having these systems at the table, I think, is so important as a first step to recognizing humanity, but then also thinking about how do we disincentivize profit over humanity? In other words, how are we going to incentivize really just humanity and incentivize really supporting hope and in the pursuit of resilience, community resilience?
Great, Wendy, thanks so much. And just to call out, your team is going to have a workshop today to talk about the tool a little bit, and we have another workshop on policy issues. And I think that encourage people to think about all of those things, because we really need to have a wide lens if we're going to pursue healthy outcomes from positive experiences. I have some questions that have been typed in, and there are a couple that were for me that really talked about my statement that child abuse did not increase during the pandemic. And that goes against what a lot of media accounts have been. So first, the survey that we quoted was done by an organization called YouGov.com. They have 5 million parents, 5 million people in the US who opt into surveys, and they help us produce a random sample that roughly corresponds to the demographics of the whole country. And we ran this survey in 3 rounds in November, February, and July. Each had about 3,000 parents responding. So it's a pretty good cross-section of the United States. And those results, of course, we couldn't ask people, did you abuse your children? That's not something that you can ask in a survey. But that's what gives us the understanding of how parents protected their children and protected their family life. And Lauren McCullough, part of our team, is now working with a team of qualitative researchers to specifically evaluate open text comments about families, facilitators, and barriers to family life during the pandemic. And I think the reason that I'm so convinced that child abuse decreased is we have that survey result and focus groups that tell us what parents say and what they experienced. We also have child abuse reports that went down. And of course they went down because children weren't in school. But if you look at the data, 20% of reports in a normal year come from schools. But child abuse reports fell 40 to 70%. So much more than the schools. Child abuse from every category of provider, every category of reporter, neighbors, police, healthcare, everything went down. So you could argue maybe there was something else going on. Then you also have to reconcile that with fewer children showed up at emergency departments, many fewer children for child physical abuse, and many fewer children were hospitalized for abusive head trauma, the most common form of child abuse in infancy. So we think that all of those things point to there being a real phenomenon. And the reason I point it out, honestly, is that the field of child abuse has been plagued with bias in reporting. It's really difficult to say. Sometimes it's not so difficult, but often it's difficult to say whether this is abuse or neglect or maybe suboptimal something or another. And there's a long history of bias. So you need to take reports with a grain of salt. And when people get up there and say, I know that child abuse increased, even though the data goes in the other direction, you need to be skeptical. And from our point of view at the Hope National Resource Center, understanding the strength and resilience and adaptability and stamina of American families and giving them some credit is so important in what we do. And I want to, so with that, I have a couple questions for you too. So let me bring them up on my screen and read them to you. First question. Someone asked, if primary care providers want to do something to help foster change in the upstream factors, can you suggest one or two reachable things we could do in our communities?
Yeah, so, one of the things, two of the programs that I had on that screen, one of them was the Parent Connects, and that one is extremely reachable, maybe not as far as the full integration into primary care, but, when the pediatricians at Cincinnati Children's Hospital came together with Parent Connect to form Parent Connects with Beach Acres, the Beach Acres program was actually something, their parent coach program that had been long existing, where they were taking parents who had prior experience, unfortunately, with Child Protective Services and have been working with them to be much more positive in their parenting and understanding that these were parents who oftentimes had cycled through the foster care system themselves. And so they had lived experience that they had not dealt with and perhaps not positive parenting experience as a child themselves. And so recognizing that these individuals could not only were they becoming more positive parents for themselves, but the effect of being positive parents and a peer coach was something that was very important and powerful within the community. The idea of being able to connect those two that is attainable. And it doesn't, in the Cincinnati model, they are using Medicaid funding, flexible funding to support the parent coaches as CHWs in the practice, but it does not have to be that elaborate. You can work with other agencies that are in community, but you first have to have the conversation with community to understand not only what are the needs, but what are the resources that we can already bring to bear. So that is reachable regardless of where you are by simply having a better understanding of what would be appreciated by your parents. What are some of the gaps that need to be filled, and then understanding what are some of the resources that are already available. One of the other things that one of our partners did in Portland, Oregon, was when they had the opportunity to redesign the elementary school, the Fabian School, and they actually worked with parents to understand not just what they would like to see as far as their child's educational experience, but what are some of the needs in community. And one of the issues that came to their attention was the fact that parents didn't have a safe third space. Meaning, there wasn't a neighborhood Starbucks where parents could meet for coffee or a park where they could meet where they felt like they were safe. But the one place where communities seemed to gather was at the school. And so when they were redesigning the school, they purposefully created a living room of sorts for parents so that after they dropped their kids off, they could actually meet and talk to one another. And one of the benefits of having just that third space that was created was you got increased parental engagement, but also increased parental engagement, not just in the classroom, but also with their child, because they became part of this larger community that was fostering not just the relationships between the parents, but also fostering hope with the children as far as their academic performance was concerned. So there, when we talk about, the low-hanging fruit, think about parents as one of those very important and essential ingredients to really understanding what they need, but also the resources that we can already bring to bear, whether that's a school, whether that's a pediatric office, whether that's a third space in community. Those are things that we can do without big P policy change. Some of those things will require big P policy change, but as we build these relationships and we begin to build some of the outcomes, the positive outcomes, we can get closer to that systems change. And I think that that's really important because many of us have been doing that in one respect or another, but perhaps have not been putting it in the frame of we're making moves towards that larger systems change.
Wendy, I love the examples you gave, and I can't help but think that all those changes that you mentioned, how relatively inexpensive they are in the overall healthcare budget. The idea that Medicaid's paying for parent coaches, because as a doctor, you can prescribe a very expensive antibiotic that would be just as good as a cheap one, or because the child has a virus, would be just as good as nothing. No one looks at that. But when you start to say something that's effective, like a parent coach, all of a sudden, it's terrible.
Well, and the interesting thing too is, so Dr. Bob Shapiro, who was leading that program, they've recently published an article that demonstrates some of the return on this investment. And so what you've seen is reduction in behavioral health issues for the children and reduction in household stress. And so when we think about the framing of the pair of ACEs, if we're seeing a reduction in household stress because parents have an effective coach, an effective partner that isn't just a pediatrician or a therapist, but someone that they see as themselves, we know that that's a preventive and a protective factor for both the child as well as the parent. And so that's, that couldn't be any more inexpensive. And, when we think about community health workers, we've usually just kind of kept it in this narrow space of this bridge between health and community. But what if we actually looked at our community health workforce as hope builders and catalysts for resilience, meaning that they're not just connecting community to health, but they're important bridge builders to other systems that ultimately help to grow hope.
And I also just want to highlight what you just said, because it also talks about a small P policy change, because in many places you need a bachelor's degree to get this and that job. But to actually do the work, you don't need a bachelor's degree, but it's just an artificial barrier to preventing people in the community from really doing what they do best. They need training, they need support, but you don't get that necessarily from college. So we need to work really broadly on the big changes and the small ones that make it work. I have two more questions because I'd be happy to have a dialogue with you for the rest of the day, but let me get to these questions. Dr. Ellis, I agree there's absolutely an issue that systems need to address, but how? I struggle with identifying specific strategies that systems, and for this questioner, their state government, can do. How do I get them to listen, to understand, and to share the responsibility?
Mm-hmm. So there's the big I, meaning I is a singular person, and then there's the big W, we. And so there's always power in numbers. And I think that's why we push so much around the community resilience model, this idea of social cohesion and the social capital. While we as academics or leaders or practitioners may have an easier access because we're invited to these tables with the big leaders, we may not necessarily actually have the power to make the change or influence change because this is our job. But when you have constituents at the table demanding change, coupled with the evidence that we can bring as professionals, that's a different conversation. And so I think it's the power of we, not just I, that actually will move the needle. And, I know that there are some that will go, oh yeah, she's just, sipping the Kool-Aid right now. But we've seen demonstrable change in that. We've seen, some very unlikely suspects supporting trauma-informed bills. I mean, you heard Dr. Sege speak at the very beginning about the fact that we've gotten at federal level this idea that there's appropriations to support trauma-informed supports, training, and what have you. Now, that didn't come just because of the scientific findings. It came because community and constituents were actually demanding it. So it was the power of we and not just the power of I or the big academic piece of it. It was the power of community. And so that is what is going to move the needle, because at the end of the day, it's the community vote that actually holds the power. And I think oftentimes we have forgotten about that connection to power. And that's one of the things that we absolutely should be leveraging, and particularly at the local and the state level, where we have much more influence and much more power than just big P policy at the federal level.
Yep. Really appreciate that. And I live in New England, and we have town meeting form of government. So affecting our town meeting literally just involves showing up and being unsilenceable. And, I think these are so important. I just want to also put a little shout out that in many communities, there are lawyers who do public interest law. And we've partnered with MLPB in different communities around the country and found places where you can tweak policies to help families or enforce policies that exist and just don't happen. And in some cases, it's just a question of getting information about, because we know that a substantial number of people don't take advantage of things that they are entitled to because of myths or rumors or because their landlord tells them not to. So I think that there's a lot of places that you can change the local level. But my Uncle Sam has all the money, so I think they're important too. So I really appreciate that. And there's one more question that's sort of in that same direction. In my community, ARPA funds are being made available to support community organizations. And how can what can we do to facilitate an integrated approach to using those funds?
Yeah, the ARPA funds are oftentimes this untapped resource that we've seen, where unfortunately they've become politicized depending upon what are your local politics. I know that there are some counties that are lagging in releasing those funds, and I would say as community advocates, again, it is that power of we that will push the dial to release those funds. So I think, when we have these opportunities to actually fund some of the things that have been really innovative during COVID-19, what we've seen is that, whether it is the public school systems coming together with mental health providers to expand telehealth, say we've seen that in Texas and Dallas in particular, or whether it was looking at the local library system that was partnered with the public school system to create more expanded Wi-Fi access for parents as well as for children who were learning from home. It is really identifying, again, what is the community need? And oftentimes that community need is dependent upon multiple systems. And so having that community voice and seeing where those systems can be knitted together. And I would say many of the innovations that we have seen during COVID-19, let's be vigilant that those things don't go away. Number one, the systems have demonstrated that it can work, whether that's expanded access to telehealth, whether that's the virtual visits for home visits for through the McV program. Let's be vigilant in making sure that those things don't go away. Number one, they've demonstrated that they can be done. they've demonstrated that they can be effective, and they've demonstrated that we actually have the supports to make it happen, which before COVID, we would have been told, absolutely not, that's not going to work, or that's not an appropriate use of funding, or it's not going to be effective. Well, guess what? It took a pandemic, we figured it out. So let's build off of those things that unfortunately, it took a pandemic for us to see that they work, but let's be vigilant in making sure that we're actually creating permanency to these programs. Let's not give an inch, because at the end of the day, this is what our families, what our children absolutely need.
Wow. I'm going to let you have that as the last word before we go in for the afternoon. I just want to shout out to you because you say we, and you're doing it. I remember that map you showed at the beginning of all the communities that you're doing. We've also have Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett as part of our advisory board. And Dr. Boynton-Jarrett has a group called Vital Villages that also uses that collective impact, or whatever you want to call it, but the power of we. And again, some of these things are really big changes, and some of them are just an accumulation of nuisances, like Wi-Fi, that don't require like rebuilding the whole city, but do require a little bit of investment for an enormous return. And I just want to shout out to you for working with the communities, finding out what they need, and helping them identify the power levers so that we can make those changes so that children and families can live in environments that promote positive childhood experiences. And it's such an honor to work with you. Mm-hmm. I just want to I also want to go. You're about to say something. I'm sorry.
No. I was just going to thank you. Just thank you for everything that you do. And I really appreciate the framing around hope. It is just so fundamentally important. We can put all of these structures in place, but if we don't foster hope, we're getting nowhere. So thank you.
Thanks. And if someone from We and Goliath can put up the afternoon schedule. Today, Dr. Ellis and I were the warm-up act. We have 3 sessions of workshops this afternoon. Is there a slide that lists all the workshops, or should I just read them out to you all? Okay. What I want to do is just tell you some of the workshops, and you may have seen them on the website already. But Dr. Gretchen Pianka from Maine is going to be talking about first aid for toxic stress. Jennifer Jones from Prevent Child Abuse America will be leading a workshop on hope and child abuse prevention. Amy Zeitz from San Diego will be talking about hope in communities and the really amazing work they've done. Reverend Kirsten Peachy will be talking about hope and faith and leading a discussion about that. Dr. Ellis and her team will be exploring this tool that she unveiled today and leading a workshop on hope and resilient community environments. There are policy opportunities that can advance hope and early relational health, and Kay Johnson and David Willis will be leading this. Jeff Linkenbach will be leading a wonderful seminar on positive community norms and hope. Allison Stevens and Elliot Hinkle will be talking about lived experience. June Lee from the Harvard Graduate School of Education will be talking about developing good enough relationship to support children and their families. I just want to say many of these repeat over the afternoon. Look at the schedule, help yourself. Session 1 from 1 to 2, session 2 from 2:10 to 3:10, session 3 from 3:20 to 4:20, and then afterwards we have a delightful opportunity for networking using some pretty amazing technology on our Summit platform, because there are nearly 300 people here now. And stick around, get a chance to meet people, to talk, and to enjoy each other. And again, thank you all for your attention, for taking a day out of your busy lives to be here with us. We hope that learning about growing hope will help you in the work you do with children and families and give you a sense of inspiration and hope for your work. And once again, thank you to Dr. Ellis, and thank you to my team, particularly Isabel Pignazzi, Lauren McCullough, Dina Burstein, Laura Gallant, Amanda Wynn, and Allison Stevens, who made today possible. So we'll see you all at the workshops after lunch.